The phone call came at 11:43 at night, just as I was finishing my second straight shift in the emergency room. My scrubs were stained with blood from a car accident victim, and my feet ached in my worn nursing shoes. When I saw the unknown number, I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Ashley Morrison?" The woman's voice was professional but concerned. "This is Janet Williams from Child Protective Services. We have your daughter Emma here at our office. She was left at Fire Station 12 with a note." My knees buckled. "What?" "That's impossible. She's with my parents for the weekend." The social worker's next words destroyed my world. The note says, "Sorry, sweetie, we just couldn't take care of her." My hands trembled so violently that I could barely grip the steering wheel as I raced across town to the CPS office. The fluorescent lights in the waiting room felt too bright, too harsh against my exhausted eyes. Through a window, I spotted Emma hunched in a plastic chair, her favorite purple teddy bear clutched against her chest. Her usually neat braids were disheveled, and her eyes were red and swollen from crying. "Mommy!" She launched herself into my arms the moment I entered the room. Her small body shook with sobs as I held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo mixed with something else. Fear. My baby smelled like fear. Janet Williams sat across from us, her expression grave as she pushed a manila folder across the desk. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to show you something." Inside was a grainy printout from security footage. The timestamp read 10:22 p.m. The image showed my parents clear as day, walking away from the fire station entrance. My mother's silver hair was unmistakable, as was my father's distinctive limp from his old knee injury. "Emma, sweetheart." I kept my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. "Can you tell Mommy what happened with Grandma and Grandpa?" Emma's voice came out in hiccuping whispers. "They said we were going on an adventure. Grandma packed my backpack with Mr. Bunny and some crackers." She kept looking at her phone and telling Grandpa to hurry. "When we got to the fire station, Grandpa said I needed to wait inside for a special surprise. Grandma kissed my forehead and said she was sorry. Then they left. I waited and waited, but they never came back." My phone buzzed. Sarah, my best friend since nursing school, had sent a screenshot from Facebook. My blood turned to ice. There were my parents posted just 30 minutes ago raising tropical drinks on a beach. The caption read, "Finally living our best lives in paradise with our wonderful grandchildren." In the background, 3 children played in the sand. Madison's kids. My sister's perfect neurotypical children. "Mrs. Morrison." Janet's voice cut through my shock. "We need to discuss next steps. This is a clear case of child abandonment. Have you been in contact with your parents?" I shook my head, still staring at the photo. They looked so happy, so carefree, like they hadn't just thrown away their granddaughter like a piece of trash. "I need to make some calls," I managed to say. My first call went straight to voicemail. So did the second. And the third. Then I tried Madison. She answered on the first ring, and I could hear the ocean in the background. "Oh, Ashley." Her voice was bright, fake cheerful. "How are you? We're having such an amazing time here in Maui. The kids are building sandcastles with Mom and Dad." "Where is Emma's college fund?" The words came out sharp, cutting through her act. Silence. Then a nervous laugh. "What do you mean?" "The $20,000 I've been saving since she was born. The money Mom and Dad were keeping safe in their savings account. Where is it, Madison?" "I don't know what you're talking about." But her voice had gone high the way it always did when she lied. "Emma is in foster care." I watched my daughter curl tighter into herself at those words. "Mom and Dad abandoned her at a fire station and flew to Hawaii with your kids using her college money." "That's ridiculous. You must be confused. Maybe you're just overwhelmed with work and—" I hung up. My next call was to the bank. After verifying my identity, the representative confirmed my worst fears. The joint account I'd set up with my parents for Emma's education had been emptied 2 days ago. $22,437. Gone. I looked at Emma, still clutching Mr. Bunny, still trusting me to make everything better. My parents hadn't just abandoned her. They'd stolen her future to pay for a vacation where she wasn't welcome. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was planned, calculated, cruel. Janet handed me a box of tissues. I hadn't realized I was crying. "Mrs. Morrison, I know this is overwhelming, but we need to file a formal report. This is criminal child abandonment, and with the financial theft, it becomes even more serious." As I signed the papers with shaking hands, Emma tugged on my sleeve. "Mommy, did I do something wrong? Is that why Grandma and Grandpa left?" I knelt down to her eye level, taking her small face in my hands. "No, baby, you did nothing wrong. Nothing at all. Sometimes adults make very bad choices, and this is about them, not you. You are perfect exactly as you are." But even as I said the words, I could see the doubt in her eyes. The seed of worthlessness my parents had planted with their betrayal, and I knew that no matter what happened next, my daughter would carry this wound forever. My parents hadn't just abandoned her for one night. They'd abandoned her in every way that mattered. The next morning arrived with a pounding headache and the harsh reality that last night wasn't a nightmare. Emma had barely slept, waking every hour to make sure I was still there. I'd called in sick to work, something I never did, but my supervisor understood when I explained the situation. Now, with Emma settled in front of cartoons with a bowl of cereal, I steeled myself for the conversation I'd been dreading. Madison answered on the second ring this time. I could hear children laughing in the background, the sound of waves crashing. Perfect family vacation sounds that made my stomach turn. "We need to talk," I said without preamble, "and this time I want the truth." "Ashley, I told you yesterday." "Stop. Just stop. I have the bank records. I have the security footage. I have the CPS report. So unless you want me to add conspiracy charges to what Mom and Dad are already facing, you're going to tell me exactly what happened." A long pause. I heard her tell the kids to go play with Grandpa. Footsteps, a door closing. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its false brightness. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she began. "What wasn't supposed to happen? Abandoning an 8-year-old child. She's too much for them, Ashley. You have to understand. Mom's getting older, and with Emma's issues." "Issues?" The word came out like venom. "You mean her autism, the mild autism that requires nothing more than a little patience and understanding." "It's not just that." Madison's voice turned defensive. "She needs special attention, special food, special routines. When my kids visit, they're easy. They play by themselves. They eat whatever Mom makes. They don't have meltdowns when the schedule changes." Meltdowns. Emma hasn't had a meltdown in over a year, and that's only because she's learned coping strategies in therapy. Therapy I pay for. "Well, Mom says..." "What does Mom say, Madison? What poison has she been feeding you about my daughter?" The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. When Madison finally spoke, her words confirmed my worst suspicions. "She says Emma isn't really family, not like my kids. She says it's because of Richard's genes that his family was always a little off, and now Emma..." "Richard is dead." My voice was ice. "My husband died serving this country, and you're blaming him for Emma being autistic." "I'm just telling you what Mom said. She thinks Emma is too difficult, too expensive, too different. She said it wasn't fair that they had to watch her when she's such a burden. So when I suggested a family vacation, we all agreed it would be better if you left her behind like an unwanted pet. We were going to tell you after the vacation. We thought if you saw how happy everyone was without the stress of managing Emma's needs, you'd understand. Maybe find a special boarding school or something." I was on my feet without realizing it, pacing the kitchen, my free hand clenched into a fist. "How long have you been planning this?" "A few months. Mom started talking about it after Emma's birthday party. You remember when she got overwhelmed by all the noise and needed to go to her quiet room. Mom was so embarrassed in front of her church friends." the birthday party. I remembered it clearly. Emma had done so well for the first hour playing with the other children enjoying her princess cake. But when the noise level got too high and too many people tried to hug her at once, she'd politely ask to take a break. It was a perfect example of her using the self-advocacy skills we'd been working on. I'd been so proud, and my mother had been embarrassed. "I need to see the emails," I said. What emails? Don't play dumb, Madison. You just admitted to planning this for months. There have to be emails, texts, something. Ashley, just let this go. They're old. They made a mistake. Can't you just... Oh, forward me everything. Every email, every text, every conversation you've had about my daughter, or I'll subpoena them during the criminal trial. She gasped. Criminal trial? You can't be serious. They're our parents. They abandoned a child. They stole money. Those are felonies, Madison. So yes, I'm deadly serious. You're overreacting. They just needed a break. All grandparents need breaks. Then they could have called me, told me they needed a break, not abandoned her at a fire station with a note like she's an unwanted baby. Mom said you wouldn't understand. She said you'd make them feel guilty for not wanting to watch her. She said, you always make everything so difficult. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I make everything difficult. I work 60 hours a week to provide for my daughter. I've never asked them for money, just occasional babysitting. I pay for all of Emma's therapy, her special diet, her sensory tools. All I've ever asked is that they love her. And apparently, that was too difficult. My phone buzzed with an email notification. Madison had forwarded a thread, probably hoping it would calm me down. It had the opposite effect. The subject line read, Operation Fresh Start. I scrolled through message after message, each one more horrifying than the last. My mother referring to Emma as the burden. My father calculating how much they could get from Emma's college fund for a real family vacation. Madison suggesting they wait until I was working a double shift so I couldn't interfere. But the worst was an email from 3 weeks ago. My mother had written, "We've raised our children. We shouldn't have to raise Ashley's mistake too. Emma will never be normal, never be the granddaughter we dreamed of. It's time we stop pretending she's equal to Madison's children. They deserve all our love and attention, not the scraps left over after dealing with Emma's special needs." I sank into a kitchen chair, the phone shaking in my hand. Through the doorway, I could see Emma carefully arranging her toy horses in a perfect line, humming softly to herself. My beautiful, brilliant daughter, who could name every constellation in the summer sky, who read at a 6th grade level, who showed more empathy and kindness than her grandparents ever had, reduced to a mistake in their eyes. "Ashley, are you still there?" "I'm here." My voice was steady, now filled with cold determination. "And here's what's going to happen. You're going to forward me every piece of communication about this. You're going to tell me exactly how much of Emma's money went to this vacation. And then you're going to explain to your children why their Aunt Emma isn't worth loving. Don't bring my kids into this." "You already did. You taught them that family is conditional, that love has prerequisites, that some children matter more than others. You think you're giving them a perfect vacation, but you're teaching them that cruelty is acceptable if the victim is different." "That's not... We didn't..." "Yes, you did. And Madison, when your children grow up and face their own challenges when they're not perfect anymore, remember this moment. Remember how easily you threw away a child for being different, because someday you might be the one who's too difficult, too much of a burden, too imperfect to love." I hung up before she could respond. There would be time for more conversations, more confrontations, but right now I had evidence to gather and a daughter to protect. My parents and sister had been planning this betrayal for months, referring to my child as a burden to be discarded. They were about to learn that Emma wasn't the burden. Their cruelty was, and I was going to make sure the whole world knew it. By 10 a.m., I was sitting in the office of Catherine Chen, the best family law attorney in the city. She came highly recommended by a fellow nurse whose ex-husband had tried to kidnap their children. Catherine was everything I needed: sharp, experienced, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting children. She reviewed the evidence I'd brought, her expression growing darker with each email, each screenshot, each bank statement. Emma sat beside me quietly, working on a puzzle book I'd brought to keep her occupied. Every few minutes, she'd glance up at me, seeking reassurance that I was still there. "This is one of the clearest cases of felony child abandonment I've seen," Catherine said, setting down the papers. "Combined with the theft of her education fund, we're looking at multiple federal charges. The interstate nature of this makes it even more serious." Federal charges. I hadn't expected that. They crossed state lines in the commission of a crime. They used Emma's money, obtained through fraud, to travel to Hawaii. That brings in the FBI. She pulled out a legal pad and began making notes. "First, we need to file an emergency petition for sole custody, removing any grandparent rights they might claim. Second, we file criminal charges for abandonment and theft. Third, we pursue civil action to recover the stolen funds plus damages." "What about my sister? She was part of the planning." Catherine's smile was sharp. "Conspiracy to commit child abandonment. Conspiracy to commit fraud. She's equally liable both criminally and civilly. Her own emails prove premeditation." A soft voice interrupted us. "Ms. Catherine, will Grandma and Grandpa go to jail?" We both turned to look at Emma. I'd hoped she wasn't listening, but my daughter was too smart to miss what was happening around her. Catherine's expression softened. "That's for a judge to decide, sweetheart. But what they did was wrong, and when people do wrong things, there are consequences." Emma nodded solemnly. "Like when I hit Bradley at school and had to apologize and lost recess. Except Grandma and Grandpa did something way worse than hitting." "That's right," Catherine said. "You understand consequences very well." As Emma returned to her puzzle, Catherine turned back to me. "She's remarkably composed for what she's been through." "She's had to be," I said. "The world hasn't always been kind to her, but she's stronger than my parents ever gave her credit for." We spent the next 2 hours documenting everything. Catherine had me write out a detailed timeline of events, including every instance I could remember of my parents treating Emma differently from Madison's children. The list was longer than I'd realized. Birthday parties where Emma's gifts were noticeably smaller. Christmas dinners where she was seated at the far end of the table. Family photos where she was positioned at the edge, easily cropped out. "This establishes a pattern of discrimination," Catherine explained. "It's not just about one night of abandonment. It's about systematic, emotional abuse." By noon, we were at the police station. Detective Marcus Thompson, a tall man with kind eyes and graying temples, took our statement. He was particularly gentle with Emma, crouching down to her level and speaking softly. "Emma, I know this is scary, but you're being very brave. Can you tell me what happened when your grandparents took you to the fire station?" Emma looked at me for permission. I nodded encouragingly. "Grandma said I was going to have an adventure. She packed Mr. Bunny and some goldfish crackers in my backpack, but she forgot my noise-canceling headphones and I asked for them, but she said I wouldn't need them. That made me worried because I always need them in new places." Detective Thompson made notes. "That was smart of you to notice. What happened next?" We drove for a long time. Grandpa kept looking in the mirror at me. He looked sad. When we got to the fire station, Grandma walked me to the door. She said to wait inside and someone nice would come get me. She kissed my head and said she was sorry. Then she left really fast. "Did she say anything else?" Emma's lower lip trembled. She said, "Maybe this is better for everyone." I didn't know what that meant. I still don't. I wrapped my arm around Emma as she started to cry. Detective Thompson pushed a box of tissues across his desk. "You did nothing wrong, Emma. Nothing at all. Your grandparents made bad choices, but that's not your fault." After Emma's statement, Detective Thompson spoke with us privately, while a victim advocate stayed with Emma. The FBI will want to take over this case, he explained. Interstate flight to avoid prosecution, wire fraud conspiracy. Your parents are looking at serious federal charges. I'll contact the field office this afternoon. How long before they're arrested? I asked. With clear evidence and known whereabouts, I'd say 24 to 48 hours. The fact that they used the stolen money to fund their flight makes this a priority. No judge is going to look kindly on grandparents who steal from a special needs child's education fund. As we left the police station, Emma slipped her hand into mine. Mommy, are we gonna be okay? I squeezed her hand gently. We're going to be better than okay, baby. We're going to make sure this never happens to another child again. That evening, while Emma slept, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop researching. The more I learned about elder financial abuse and child abandonment, the more I realized how common these crimes were. Grandparents who felt entitled to their grandchildren's inheritance, families who discarded special needs, children like broken toys. My phone rang just after 9. Catherine's name appeared on the screen. Good news, she said without preamble. I've been in touch with the FBI. They're very interested in this case. Apparently, your parents' credit card records show some interesting purchases in the weeks leading up to the abandonment. What kind of purchases? Luggage. Lots of it. First-class tickets for 5 to Hawaii. Hotel reservations made months in advance. All paid for with cashier's checks from Emma's education fund. They were converting the money to hide the trail, but they weren't smart about it. The bank has records of everything. Months, I repeated. They've been planning this for months while looking me in the eye and pretending to love my daughter. It's worse than that, Catherine said. I had my investigator do some digging. This isn't the first time your parents have done something like this. My blood ran cold. What do you mean? Your late husband's mother, Dorothy Morrison. She died in a nursing home 2 years ago, correct? Yes, she had dementia. My parents said they found her the best facility. The cheapest facility, while they sold her house and kept the profits. Your husband's military death benefits that should have gone to his mother redirected to your parents' accounts. They've been doing this for years, Ashley. Emma is just their latest victim. I closed my eyes, feeling sick. Richard's mother had died alone in a state-run facility while my parents lived off her money. How had I been so blind? What do we do now? We build our case. We show a pattern of elder abuse, child abuse, and financial exploitation. Your parents aren't just facing a few years in prison, they're looking at decades. And your sister? She's going down with them. After I hung up, I checked on Emma one more time. She was sleeping peacefully, Mr. Bunny clutched to her chest. In the soft glow of her nightlight, she looked so young, so vulnerable. My parents had looked at this precious child and seen only a burden to be discarded. Tomorrow, the FBI would be knocking on their hotel room door. Tomorrow, their tropical paradise would become a nightmare of their own making. But tonight, I held my daughter close and promised her what my parents never could: unconditional love. Forever and always, no matter what. The call from Special Agent Rebecca Martinez came at 6:45 the next morning. I was making Emma's breakfast, carefully arranging her scrambled eggs and toast in the specific pattern she preferred, when my phone buzzed with an unknown Hawaii number. Ms. Morrison, this is Special Agent Martinez with the FBI's Honolulu field office. I want to update you on the status of your case. My hand stilled on the spatula. Have you located them? We have. They're staying at the Grand Wailea Resort in Maui, registered under your father's name. They used Emma's education fund to book the presidential suite for 2 weeks. The presidential suite. While Emma slept in a CPS office, terrified and abandoned, my parents were living in luxury, bought with her future. Our agents are coordinating with local law enforcement for the arrest. We've obtained warrants for child abandonment, interstate flight to avoid prosecution, and wire fraud. We're also adding theft of government benefits after discovering they've been collecting disability payments for Emma while planning to abandon her. Disability payments. This was news to me. I never applied for disability for Emma. According to Social Security records, your mother has been collecting them for the past 2 years. Nearly $24,000 total. Did you sign any paperwork authorizing this? I thought back, remembering a stack of school forms my mother had asked me to sign during a particularly hectic week. My stomach dropped. She said they were for Emma's school records. I trusted her. We'll add forgery and Social Security fraud to the charges. Ms. Morrison, we've also discovered something else. Your parents have been accessing your late husband's military survivor benefits. Benefits that should have gone directly to you and Emma. I sank into a kitchen chair, the room spinning. How much have they stolen? Between the education fund disability payments and survivor benefits, we're looking at approximately $96,000 over the past 3 years. Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. Mommy, is breakfast ready? I forced myself to smile. Almost, sweetheart. Why don't you set the table? As Emma carefully placed forks and napkins, Agent Martinez continued, We've frozen all their accounts. The hotel has been notified that their credit cards will be declined if they try to check out. We have agents positioned at the airport in case they attempt to flee. Would you like to be notified when the arrest takes place? Morhamarso. Yes, please. And Agent Martinez, when you arrest them, my sister Madison is with them. She was part of the conspiracy. We're aware. We have warrants for all 3 adults. The children will be placed with local social services until arrangements can be made. After I hung up, I helped Emma with her breakfast, marveling at her resilience. She chatted about the book she was reading, a fantasy story about a girl who could talk to dragons. Her ability to find joy despite everything made my parents' betrayal even more unforgivable. Catherine called an hour later. I just got off the phone with the federal prosecutor. They're taking this very seriously. The fact that your parents targeted both a disabled child and a deceased veteran's mother shows a pattern of exploiting vulnerable family members. Agent Martinez said they've stolen $96,000. That we know of. My investigator is still digging. Ashley, I need to ask you something difficult. Has anyone else in your family died in the past few years? Any other relatives who might have had money or benefits? I thought hard. My dad's brother, Uncle Tony, he died 4 years ago. He was a bachelor, no kids. My parents handled his estate. I'll look into it. These kinds of predators rarely stop at 1 or 2 victims. By 10 a.m., I was at work trying to focus on my patients while my phone sat silent in my locker. Every time I administered medication or checked vitals, part of my mind was in Hawaii, imagining federal agents surrounding my parents' luxury suite. During my lunch break, I found 17 missed calls from Madison. I listened to the first voicemail. Ashley, this is insane. The FBI is here. They're saying something about wire fraud and child abandonment. You need to call them off right now. Mom and Dad are old. They don't deserve this. I deleted it and the rest without listening. She'd made her choice when she conspired to throw away my daughter. At 2:17 p.m., my phone rang. Agent Martinez. The arrests have been made, she said simply. All 3 adults are in custody. Your parents and sister were by the pool when we arrived. They did not go quietly. What happens now? They'll be held in federal detention pending transport back to the mainland. Given the flight risk and the severity of the charges, bail is unlikely. The children have been placed with Hawaiian Child Services. Do you want to pursue custody of your sister's children? I thought of Emma, already traumatized and needing stability. Could I handle 4 children? But then I imagined Madison's kids in foster care paying for their mother's crimes. I need to think about it. Can you make sure they're placed together in the meantime? Of course. Ms. Morrison, I should warn you, the media has gotten wind of this story. Grandparents abandoning a special needs child to vacation with their other grandchildren. It's going to be big news. She was right. By evening, my phone was blowing up with calls from reporters. The headline on the local news read, Grandparents arrested in Hawaii after abandoning autistic granddaughter. The story had everything the media loved: wealthy retirees, a vulnerable child, stolen money, and a tropical paradise turned crime scene. I turned off the TV when they showed footage of my parents being led away in handcuffs. My mother's perfect vacation outfit wrinkled and her carefully styled hair mussed. Madison was sobbing dramatically for the cameras playing the victim even now. Emma found me crying in the kitchen after she was supposed to be asleep. "Mommy, are you sad about Grandma and Grandpa?" I pulled her onto my lap, this brave little girl who deserved so much better. "I'm sad about the choices they made. I'm sad they couldn't see how wonderful you are. But I'm not sad they're facing consequences. When people hurt children, they need to be stopped." Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this with her usual thoughtfulness. Maybe they'll learn to be better people in jail, like how I learned to use my words instead of hitting when I was mad. I kissed the top of her head, marveling at her capacity for hope. "Maybe, baby, maybe." That night, after Emma was asleep, I sat at my computer researching. The Grand Wailea Presidential Suite cost $1,500 per night. Their first-class tickets were $3,000 each. The receipts Agent Martinez had mentioned showed shopping sprees at luxury stores, expensive dinners, helicopter tours, all while claiming Emma was too expensive to care for. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it, assuming it was another reporter, but something made me open it. "You're a terrible daughter," it read. "Your parents gave you everything, and this is how you repay them. Some of us from church are starting a fund for their legal defense. That poor little girl of yours is better off without a mother like you." I stared at the message, a cold fury building in my chest. Even now, even with all the evidence of their crimes, there were people who would take their side. People who would look at Emma and see a burden rather than a blessing. I screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Catherine. If my parents' church friends wanted to get involved, they could explain themselves to the FBI, because I was done protecting people who wouldn't protect my daughter. The local news updated their story with security footage from the Maui hotel. The grainy video showed my parents laughing by the pool, Madison's children playing in the water, tropical drinks in hand. The timestamp showed it was taken just hours after they'd abandoned Emma. While she sat terrified in a fire station, they were toasting their freedom. I turned off my phone and checked on Emma one more time. She'd kicked off her covers and was sprawled across her bed, Mr. Bunny fallen to the floor. I tucked her back in, smoothing her hair away from her face. In sleep, she looked even younger than her 8 years. "I promise you," I whispered, "they will never hurt you again. Never make you feel less than. Never make you doubt your worth. You are not a burden. You are a gift. And anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to be in your life." Tomorrow would bring more challenges: lawyers, reporters, well-meaning friends who couldn't understand how I could prosecute my own parents. But tonight, Emma was safe. Tonight, she was loved. Tonight, that was enough. The footage from the hotel security cameras would later go viral, but I first saw it on Agent Martinez's laptop in a small conference room at the FBI field office. She'd called me in to review evidence for the upcoming federal case and warned me that what I was about to see might be disturbing. Nothing could have prepared me for the reality. The first clip showed my parents at the resort's check-in desk, my father sliding Emma's college fund across the counter in the form of traveler's checks. They were smiling, laughing, even as the clerk upgraded them to the presidential suite. The timestamp showed this was mere hours after they'd abandoned Emma at the fire station. "This establishes premeditation," Agent Martinez explained. "They had to have ordered these travelers' checks weeks in advance." The next clip was from the pool bar the following morning. My mother, in a designer swimsuit I'd never seen before, was regaling a group of tourists with some story that had them all laughing. My father was teaching Madison's eldest son, Trevor, how to dive. Madison lounged on a cabana bed, getting a massage. They looked like a family enjoying a dream vacation, because that's exactly what it was funded by a little girl's future. Now, Agent Martinez said, this is from yesterday morning, approximately 8:15 a.m. local time. The screen showed the pool area again, peaceful and sunny. Then, like a scene from a movie, FBI agents in dark suits appeared from multiple directions. The tourists scattered. Madison jumped up from her massage table, her face a mask of confusion turning to horror. My mother dropped her morning Mai Tai, the glass shattering on the concrete. What happened next was both satisfying and painful to watch. My father tried to run his bad knee forgotten in his panic. He made it about 10 feet before an agent caught up with him. My mother started screaming about her rights, her church connections, her age. Madison grabbed her children, trying to use them as a shield, yelling that they couldn't arrest her in front of her babies. The agents were professional, calm, methodical. They separated the children, first having a female agent in casual clothes lead them away from the scene. Then they proceeded with the arrests. My father went down first, his face pressed against the pool deck as they cuffed him. My mother's arrest was more dramatic. She actually took a swing at an agent, her perfectly manicured nails raking across his cheek before she was restrained. But it was Madison's arrest that was hardest to watch. Not because I felt sorry for her, but because of her children's reactions. 10-year-old Trevor tried to protect his mother, placing himself between her and the agents. 8-year-old Sophia was crying, begging the agents not to take her mommy. 6-year-old James just stood there, thumb in his mouth, looking lost. The children were placed with Hawaii's Child Protective Services within an hour, Agent Martinez said gently. They're together in a good foster home. The foster mother is experienced with traumatized children. I thought of Emma, how terrified she'd been at the fire station. Now 3 more children were experiencing that same fear because of their parents' choices. The cycle of trauma spreading like ripples in a pond. What did my parents say when you arrested them? I asked. Agent Martinez pulled up another file. Your father immediately asked for a lawyer. Your mother was less cooperative. She kept insisting this was all a misunderstanding, that you were an unfit mother who'd abandoned Emma and they were trying to protect her by leaving her at a fire station. She claimed you'd agreed to it, said you were overwhelmed with work and had asked them to find Emma a better situation. Of course, she couldn't produce any evidence of this agreement. And Madison? Your sister tried to claim she had no knowledge of the abandonment. Said she thought Emma was staying with a specialized caregiver for the week. But her own emails contradicted that story. She knew exactly what was happening. The next video was from the Federal Detention Center. My parents in orange jumpsuits, looking small and old without their vacation clothes and careful styling. The transformation was shocking. In less than 24 hours, they'd gone from living in luxury to facing the reality of their crimes. They were denied bail this morning, Agent Martinez continued. The judge considered them flight risks given they'd already fled to Hawaii. Your mother's assault on a federal agent didn't help their case. She assaulted an agent. I hadn't heard that part. Minor scratches, but assault nonetheless. It's been added to her charges. Your father is facing 15 to 20 years. Your mother with the assault charge could see 20 to 25. Your sister is looking at 10 to 15. The numbers felt surreal. My parents were in their late 60s. These sentences could mean they'd die in prison. Part of me felt a flutter of something, not quite sympathy, but a recognition of the tragedy of it all. They'd thrown away their remaining years for a vacation, destroyed their family for the price of a luxury suite. There's something else, Agent Martinez said, pulling up financial records. We've discovered more victims. Your Uncle Tony's estate that your parents handled nearly $200,000 unaccounted for. Your husband's military life insurance. They took half before it ever reached you. We're still uncovering the full extent of their theft, but it appears they've been systematically stealing from family members for at least a decade. I stared at the numbers on the screen. while I'd been working double shifts to pay for Emma's therapy, living paycheck to paycheck, my parents had been sitting on stolen hundreds of thousands. Money that should have gone to Emma's future, to Richard's mother's care, to Uncle Tony's chosen charities. The word came out as barely a whisper. They had their own retirement savings. They weren't poor. Why steal from everyone? Osai, greed, Agent Martinez said simply. Entitlement. They believed they deserved that money more than the rightful beneficiaries. Your father's emails talk about how they'd earned a comfortable retirement by raising their children. Your mother felt that Emma's special needs were an unfair burden that justified taking her money. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine. "Turn on Channel 7, now!" I excused myself and found a TV in the waiting room. The news was playing footage of the arrest, but this time with commentary. A legal expert was explaining the charges while pictures of Emma flashed on screen, her school photo showing her sweet smile and bright eyes. But it was the next segment that made my blood run cold. Madison had somehow managed to make a phone call to a reporter from detention. Her tear-stained face filled the screen as she painted herself as a victim. "My sister has always been jealous of me," Madison was saying. "She couldn't handle that our parents loved my children more. This is all just revenge. Emma wasn't abandoned. She was placed in professional care. Ashley is making this all up for attention and money." The reporter pushed back, asking about the emails, the stolen funds, the evidence. Madison just kept crying, playing the martyred mother separated from her babies. She knew exactly what she was doing, trying to poison public opinion before the trial. My phone started ringing immediately. Friends, co-workers, even distant relatives who'd seen the broadcast. I let them all go to voicemail, but one call I did answer. Emma's therapist, Dr. Sarah Whitman. "Ashley, I just saw the news. How is Emma handling all this?" "She doesn't know the full extent yet. I've told her that her grandparents made bad choices and are facing consequences, but I've tried to shield her from the details." "That's wise. But children are perceptive, especially bright ones like Emma. She's going to have questions. I'd like to schedule some extra sessions this week if possible." We arranged for Emma to see her twice in the coming week. As I hung up, Agent Martinez reappeared. "We need to discuss security," she said. "Your parents have connections, people who might believe their version of events. Your sister's interview is already gaining traction in certain circles. We want to make sure you and Emma are safe." The reality hit me like a physical blow. Not only had my parents abandoned and robbed my daughter, but now their actions were putting us in danger from their supporters. The betrayal kept expanding, touching every aspect of our lives. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "Be vigilant. Document any threats or harassment. We can arrange for increased patrols around your home and Emma's school. Don't engage with media or your parents' supporters. Let the evidence speak for itself at trial." As I drove home, I passed 3 news vans parked outside my neighborhood. They'd found us. I took a different route, entering through the back entrance, grateful for the first time for our subdivision's confusing layout. Emma was with my friend Sarah, who'd picked her up from school. They were baking cookies, Emma carefully measuring ingredients with scientific precision. She looked up as I entered flour, dusting her nose. Mommy, we're making chocolate chip cookies for the nice police officers who helped us." My heart swelled. Even in the midst of trauma, my daughter's first instinct was kindness. She was worth 1,000 of her grandparents. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. They'll love them." As Emma returned to her baking, Sarah pulled me aside. "There were reporters at the school. The principal handled it, but you might want to talk to her about additional security measures." That night, after Emma was asleep, I sat in my kitchen staring at a photo from last Christmas. All of us together around my parents' tree. Emma sitting slightly apart, my mother's hand on Madison's shoulder, while Emma got a casual pat on the head. The signs had been there all along. I'd just been too desperate to believe in family to see them. My phone rang, a number I didn't recognize but local. Against my better judgment, I answered. "You're going to burn in hell for what you're doing to your parents." The voice was female, elderly, filled with venom. That sweet couple who gave so much to the church, and you're persecuting them over a misunderstanding. You should be ashamed. I hung up without responding, but my hands were shaking. This was just the beginning. My parents had spent years cultivating their image as loving grandparents, generous church members, pillars of the community. Now I was the ungrateful daughter destroying them over money. They couldn't see Emma as anything more than a burden, and as long as people like them existed, children like Emma would continue to be thrown away, but not on my watch. Not anymore. The dominoes began falling faster than anyone expected. Within 72 hours of the arrest footage going viral, my parents' carefully constructed image crumbled like a house of cards in a hurricane. It started with their church. Pastor David, who'd known my parents for 20 years, called me on a Thursday morning. His voice was heavy with disbelief and something else. Shame, maybe. "Ashley, I owe you an apology. Several members of our congregation have come forward with disturbing information about your parents' behavior. Things we should have seen, should have addressed." I set down my coffee cup, giving him my full attention. Emma was at school, and I'd taken a rare day off to deal with the mounting legal paperwork. What kind of information? There was a fundraiser 2 years ago for the Martinez family. Their son needed cancer treatment. Your parents were in charge of the money. We raised $37,000, but the family only received $22,000. Your parents said the rest went to administrative costs. My stomach churned. They stole from a child with cancer. We can't prove it, but looking back, there were signs. They always volunteered to handle money, the building fund that never quite reached its goal, the youth group trip that cost twice what it should have. I kept their books for them, trusted them completely. You need to contact Agent Martinez at the FBI. They're investigating all of my parents' financial dealings. I already have. Ashley, there's more. Several families have mentioned how your parents talked about Emma. The things they said, no grandparent should speak that way about their grandchild. We thought they were just venting, maybe exaggerating. We didn't realize. What did they say? My voice was steady, but my hands clenched into fists. They called her defective, said she was God's punishment for some unnamed sin, claimed you were selfish for not institutionalizing her. Martha Williams heard your mother say that Emma would be better off dead than living as a burden. The words hit me like physical blows. My parents hadn't just disliked Emma's autism, they'd actively wished her harm spread poison about her to anyone who would listen. We failed you both, Pastor David continued. We should have confronted them, should have defended Emma. Instead, we stayed silent, and look what happened. I'm calling a congregational meeting. Your parents are no longer welcome in our church. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my kitchen, processing this new betrayal. They'd smiled at Emma on Sundays, given her candy, patted her head, then turned around and told their church friends she'd be better off dead. The next call came from Madison's husband, Daniel. I almost didn't answer, but something in me needed to hear what he had to say. Ashley, I'm filing for divorce and full custody. His voice was flat, emotionless. I've been going through Madison's things. She's been planning this for years. There are journals, Ashley, detailed plans about how to get your parents to cut Emma out completely so our kids would inherit everything. Daniel, I'm so sorry about your children being in foster care. If you need me to write a letter of support for your custody case, that's why I'm calling. I want you to have them. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. What? I'm being deployed for 8 months. My parents are too old to handle 3 kids. Madison's sister is just like her, maybe worse. But you've shown what real family means. You fought for Emma when everyone else threw her away. My kids need that kind of fierce love. I've already talked to my lawyer. If you're willing, I want to sign temporary guardianship over to you. Daniel, that's a huge decision. I'm a single mom with a special needs child and a demanding job. I know, But I also know my kids have been taught terrible things about Emma, about what makes someone worthy of love. They need to unlearn that poison, and who better to teach them than Emma herself? She's shown more grace and strength than any of the adults in this situation. We agreed to talk more once I'd had time to think, but as I hung up, I already knew what I was going to do. Those 3 children were victims too. They'd watched their mother choose a vacation over their cousin. They'd seen their grandparents arrested. They needed stability, love, and most importantly, they needed to learn that family isn't conditional. The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. Through the peephole, I saw my neighbor Mrs. Chen holding a casserole dish. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting judgment or questions. Instead, she thrust the dish into my hands. Lasagna. I know you hate cooking when you're stressed. And honey, I want you to know that this whole neighborhood is behind you. What your parents did, it's unconscionable. You've seen the news. Everyone has. But more than that, we've seen you and Emma. We've watched you work yourself to the bone to provide for her. We've seen her bloom under your care. She helps my grandson with his math homework, you know. Says numbers make more sense than people sometimes. Mrs. Chen's eyes grew fierce. Your parents are fools. Emma is a gift. Over the next few days, the support poured in. Meals from neighbors, offers to watch Emma. Her teacher sent home a card signed by her entire class supporting their awesome friend. The local autism support group started a fund to replace Emma's stolen college money. But it was the message from an unexpected source that broke me, Richard's army buddy Marcus, whom I hadn't heard from since the funeral. Saw the news, his email read. Richard would be proud of how you're protecting Emma. He always said she'd be special, even before she was born. Said any kid of yours would be a fighter. He was right. P.S. Some of the guys from his unit want to help. We've started a college fund for Emma. Richard died protecting other people's children. We're going to make sure his daughter is protected too. I cried, then really cried for the first time since this nightmare began. Not tears of sadness, but of gratitude. My parents had tried to convince the world that Emma was worthless, a burden better off abandoned. But the world was pushing back, showing up, proving them wrong. The media attention intensified after Madison's jailhouse interview backfired spectacularly. A tech-savvy reporter had done a deep dive into her social media history, finding posts where she'd bragged about expensive purchases while claiming to be struggling financially, photos of her designer handbags, captioned with complaints about the cost of raising children, screenshots of her mocking other parents of special needs, children in private Facebook groups. The court of public opinion turned swiftly and decisively. Zhao justice for Emma began trending. Autism advocacy groups picked up the story. Parents of special needs, children shared their own experiences with family rejection. The narrative my parents and Madison had tried to craft, one where they were victims of a vindictive daughter, crumbled under the weight of evidence and public outrage. Catherine called with updates on the civil case. Your parents' assets are being frozen. The house, the cars, the retirement accounts. It's all being cataloged for restitution. The prosecutor is also adding hate crime enhancements due to the discriminatory nature of the abandonment. Hate crime enhancements. Abandoning a child specifically because of their disability can be prosecuted as a hate crime in federal court. It could add years to their sentences. That evening, I sat down with Emma for a difficult conversation. Dr. Whitman had helped me prepare, giving me the right words for an 8-year-old to understand. Emma, you know Grandma and Grandpa made bad choices and are in timeout for grown-ups, right? She nodded solemnly. Jail, because they left me at the fire station and took my college money. Right, well, there's something else I need to tell you. Your cousins Trevor and Sophia and James, their mommy made bad choices too, so they need a place to stay for a while. How would you feel if they came to live with us? Emma's face scrunched in concentration, her thinking face. Would they be nice to me? Sometimes Trevor says mean things about how I line up my toys. We would teach them to be kind, just like you learned to be kind even when other kids didn't understand you. Do you think you could help teach them? She considered this carefully. I could teach them about patterns and how to be quiet when someone needs space. And that different doesn't mean bad. You could teach them all of that. Then yes, they can come, but they have to be nice to Mr. Bunny. I hugged her tight, this remarkable child who could offer grace to those who'd benefited from her abandonment. She was already better than 3 generations of adults who should have protected her. The next morning brought more revelations. Agent Martinez called with updates from the investigation. We've uncovered 12 victims total. Your parents have been running various forms of fraud for 15 years. Church funds, estates benefits. They specifically targeted vulnerable family members and religious organizations who trusted them. The total theft exceeds $800,000. $800,000. While I'd worked 60-hour weeks, while Emma went without the latest therapy tools, while Richard's mother died in substandard care. My parents had been sitting on nearly $1 million in stolen funds. There's something else, Agent Martinez continued. We found a storage unit in your father's name. Inside were documents relating to an attempt to have you declared an unfit mother. They'd hired a private investigator consulted with lawyers. They were building a case to take Emma from you permanently. The room spun. They were trying to get custody. Not custody. They were trying to have her made a ward of the state. The documents specifically state they wanted her placed in a state facility so they could access her survivor benefits without the responsibility of caring for her. The abandonment was Plan B when their legal efforts failed. I hung up and ran to the bathroom, losing my breakfast. They hadn't just wanted Emma gone for a week. They'd wanted her institutionalized, warehoused, erased from the family entirely. All for money, always for money. That afternoon, I met with Daniel and the social worker handling his children's case. We signed paperwork, making me their temporary guardian. The social worker warned me it would be challenging, that the children were traumatized and had been taught problematic beliefs about Emma. I raised her, I said simply. I can handle challenging. As I drove to pick them up from their foster home, I thought about cycles. How my parents' greed had traumatized 4 children. How Madison's hatred had poisoned her own kids. How easy it would be to let that cycle continue to treat these children as burdens the way Emma had been treated. But cycles can be broken. Hatred can be unlearned. And sometimes the best revenge against those who abandon children is to show those children what real love looks like. Emma had taught me that. Now she'd teach her cousins too. Dr. Sarah Whitman's office had been transformed into a small courtroom for the closed-circuit testimony. The actual courtroom was 2 floors up, where Emma's words would be broadcast to the judge, jury, and attorneys. But here, surrounded by her familiar therapeutic toys and calming blue walls, Emma could speak her truth without the overwhelming sensory experience of a packed courtroom. I sat beside her close enough to provide comfort, but not so close as to influence her testimony. Emma wore her favorite purple dress with a soft fabric that didn't irritate her skin. Mr. Bunny sat in her lap, a comfort allowed by the judge, after Dr. Whitman explained his importance to Emma's emotional regulation. The prosecutor assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had spent weeks preparing Emma in child-friendly sessions. She'd explained that telling the truth wasn't tattling, that sometimes adults needed consequences, just like children did when they made bad choices. Emma had absorbed it all with her characteristic thoughtfulness. "Emma, can you see me on the screen?" Jennifer's voice was gentle through the monitor. "Yes, Ms. Jennifer, you're wearing the blue jacket today. Blue is calming. That's why Dr. Sarah painted her office blue." A few chuckles came through the speakers from the courtroom before the judge restored order. Even in her innocence, Emma had a way of disarming people. "That's right. Now, Emma, I need you to promise to tell the truth today. Do you know what telling the truth means?" Emma nodded seriously. "It means saying what really happened, even if it makes someone sad or mad. like when I told Mrs. Peterson that Trevor put gum in Lily's hair, even though Trevor was my friend, because the truth is important. That's exactly right. Can you promise to tell the truth today? I promise. Cross my heart and hope for pie. She made the crossing motion over her chest, then looked at me. It's supposed to be hope to die, but Mommy says that's too dark for kids, so we say pie instead. That's perfectly fine. Now, Emma, can you tell us about the night your grandparents took you to the fire station? Emma's hand tightened on Mr. Bunny, but her voice remained steady. It was Friday, I remember, because Friday is pizza night, but Grandma said we were having an adventure instead. I was sad about missing pizza, but I didn't complain, because Grandma doesn't like when I complain about food. What happened when they picked you up? Grandpa seemed nervous. He kept looking at me in the mirror and asking if I was okay. Grandma told him to stop fussing. She had my backpack, the one with the butterflies on it. She put Mr. Bunny inside and some crackers, but she forgot my headphones. I asked for them because new places are loud, but she said I wouldn't need them where I was going. Did she say where you were going? Emma shook her head. Just an adventure. But it didn't feel like an adventure. Adventures are supposed to be exciting. This felt scary. Grandma kept checking her phone and telling Grandpa to drive faster. What happened when you got to the fire station? Emma's voice got smaller, but she pressed on. Grandma walked me to the door. She said to wait inside and someone nice would come get me. I asked when she'd be back, and she got this funny look on her face, like when you're trying not to cry. She said, "Sweetie, this is better for everyone." Then she kissed my head and left really fast. How did that make you feel? Confused and scared. The fire station was loud and bright. A firefighter found me crying and asked where my parents were. I said I didn't know that Grandma left me. He looked worried and called someone. Jennifer paused, letting Emma collect herself. Emma, I need to ask you about something your grandmother said. You mentioned she said, "This is better for everyone." Do you remember anything else she said? Emma nodded, her young face serious. When we were driving, I heard her on the phone. She thought I was listening to my audiobook, but I wasn't, because the story was at a scary part. She said, "Madison's right. She's too much trouble. At least now we can enjoy the real grandchildren." The courtroom audio feed went completely silent. Even though I'd read this in Emma's initial statement, hearing her say it out loud in her matter-of-fact voice was devastating. Emma, who are the real grandchildren? Trevor and Sophia and James, Madison's kids. Grandma always said they were easier because they're not artistic like me. Do you mean autistic? Yes, autistic. Sometimes I mix up words when I'm nervous. Grandma said being autistic made me harder to love, but Mommy says that's not true. She says I'm exactly the right amount of lovable just how I am. Your mom is absolutely right. Now, Emma, I want to show you something. The screen shifted to show a photo. Do you recognize this? That's my tablet, the pink one with the sparkly case. That's right, Emma. Were you recording on your tablet the night you went to the fire station? Emma looked at me, then back at the screen. I record sometimes when I feel scared. Dr. Sarah taught me to do it so we can talk about my feelings later. I forgot I was recording that night until the nice FBI lady asked to see my tablet. We're going to play a portion of that recording now. Is that okay? Emma nodded. The courtroom audio was muted, but I could imagine the tension as they played Emma's accidental recording. You could hear my mother's voice clearly. Stop looking at her like that, Harold. We discussed this. She's not our responsibility anymore. Madison's children deserve better than splitting everything with someone who will never contribute to society. My father's response was mumbled but audible. She's just a little girl. A little girl who'll drain Ashley's resources forever. Who'll never marry, never have children, never be normal. We're doing everyone a favor. Even Emma, those places are equipped for children like her. The recording stopped. Emma was crying silently, tears rolling down her cheeks. I wanted to scoop her up, but Jennifer needed to finish her questions. Emma, how does it make you feel to hear your grandmother say those things? Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, sad and confused, because I do contribute to society. I help James with his numbers because I'm good at math. I read to the kindergarten class because I read at a higher level. I make people laugh when I tell jokes. Isn't that contributing? It absolutely is. Emma, is there anything else you want the jury to know? Emma straightened in her chair, suddenly looking older than her 8 years. I want them to know that being different doesn't make you less important. Grandma and Grandpa took my money because they thought I wasn't worth it. But I am worth it. Every kid is worth it, even if they're artistic like me, even if they need headphones in loud places or have to eat foods that don't touch. We're all worth loving. Thank you, Emma. No further questions. The defense attorney's cross-examination was mercifully brief. He'd clearly been warned about badgering a child witness, especially one whose testimony was being broadcast to a jury already sympathetic to her. Emma, isn't it true that sometimes you have trouble understanding what people mean? Sometimes. That's why I ask questions when I'm confused. Mommy says asking questions is smart. So it's possible you misunderstood your grandparents' intentions. Emma tilted her head, considering. I don't think you can misunderstand leaving someone at a fire station. That's pretty clear. Even the defense attorney seemed taken aback by her logic. He quickly wrapped up and Emma was excused. As soon as the cameras turned off, I wrapped Emma in my arms. She sobbed against my shoulder, all the brave composure crumbling now that her job was done. You were so brave, baby, so brave. Did I help? Her voice was muffled against my shirt. You helped more than you know. You told the truth, and that's all anyone could ask. Dr. Whitman joined us, offering Emma a juice box and some sensory putty to help her calm down. Emma, I'm incredibly proud of you. What you did today was very difficult, and you handled it beautifully. Emma managed a small smile. Can we get pizza now? We missed Friday pizza night, and testifying makes me hungry. I laughed despite everything. Yes, sweetheart, we can absolutely get pizza. As we left the courthouse through a back entrance to avoid the media, my phone buzzed with messages from Catherine and Jennifer. Emma's testimony had been devastating for the defense. Several jurors had been seen wiping away tears. One had to be excused briefly because she was crying too hard to continue. But it was the message from an unknown number that stopped me cold. Your daughter's testimony was broadcast on the courthouse feed. I've been defending your parents to everyone who would listen, convinced this was all a misunderstanding. I was wrong. No child should ever have to be that brave. I'm sorry for doubting you. Martha Williams from your parents' church. Later that night, as I tucked Emma into bed, she asked a question that broke my heart all over again. Mommy, do you think Grandma and Grandpa will understand now that I'm worth loving? I smoothed her hair back from her face, choosing my words carefully. I don't know, baby. Some people have a hard time learning lessons, even when they're important ones. But you know what? It doesn't matter what they understand. What matters is that you understand. You are worth loving, worth fighting for, worth everything. And anyone who can't see that is missing out on knowing an amazing person. She smiled sleepily. I know. I just wish they knew too. As Emma drifted off to sleep, I sat in her room watching her breathe. Tomorrow, the media would dissect every word of her testimony. People would debate whether an 8-year-old could be a reliable witness, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that Emma had faced the people who'd thrown her away and told them in her own words that she was worth more than they'd ever believed. And she was right. She was worth everything. The federal courthouse in downtown Portland was a monument to justice, all marble columns and soaring ceilings. But on this crisp October morning, it felt more like a coliseum where my family's destruction would play out for public consumption. Media vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward an overcast sky that threatened rain. I sat in the front row of the gallery, Catherine on one side and Emma's therapist, Dr. Whitman, on the other. Behind us, the courtroom was packed with reporters, autism advocacy groups, and curious citizens drawn by the sensational nature of the case. Emma was safe at school with extra security, the principal having assured me personally that no media would be allowed near her. My parents entered in shackles, the chains clanking with each step. The orange jumpsuits had hollowed them out, stripping away the careful facade they'd maintained for decades. My mother had aged 10 years in 3 months, her usually styled hair now gray at the roots and hanging limp around her face. My father shuffled like the old man he'd always denied being, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Madison came in last, still trying to maintain some dignity despite her circumstances. She'd managed to style her hair somehow, and her jumpsuit looked almost pressed, but the dark circles under her eyes and the nervous twitch in her jaw betrayed her fear. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hawkins," the bailiff announced. Judge Hawkins was known for being tough but fair, with a particular intolerance for crimes against children. As she took her seat, her sharp eyes surveyed the packed courtroom with disapproval. "Before we begin," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "I want to make something crystal clear. This is a court of law, not a reality show. Any outbursts, any disruptions, any attempts to turn these proceedings into a spectacle will result in immediate removal. The victims in this case, particularly a young child, deserve dignity and respect. Am I understood?" A collective murmur of agreement rippled through the gallery. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh stood for her opening statement. She was everything you'd want in a prosecutor, sharp prepared and genuinely passionate about justice. She'd told me privately that in 20 years of prosecuting federal crimes, she'd never seen a case that affected her more. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, moving to stand directly in front of them. "This case is about betrayal, the deepest kind of betrayal imaginable, that of grandparents who were entrusted with the care of a vulnerable child and chose instead to abandon her like trash." She clicked a remote, and Emma's school photo appeared on the screen. Her gap-toothed smile and sparkling eyes drew several soft gasps from the jury. "This is Emma Morrison, 8 years old. Loves horses, excels at mathematics, reads at a 6th grade level. She also has autism spectrum disorder, which means she experiences the world a little differently than neurotypical children. She needs routine occasionally, requires quiet spaces, and thrives with patience and understanding." The photo changed to one of the fire station at night. On September 15th, Emma's grandparents, the defendants Harold and Margaret Fletcher, told Emma they were taking her on an adventure. Instead, they drove her to this fire station, pinned a note to her backpack that said, "Sorry, sweetie, we just couldn't take care of her," and abandoned her. They left an 8-year-old child, their own granddaughter, alone and terrified in a strange place at night. Several jurors shook their heads in disgust. One woman pressed her lips together tightly, clearly fighting emotion. "But abandonment was only part of their crime," Jennifer continued. She clicked again, showing bank records. In the months leading up to this abandonment, the defendants systematically stole from Emma's college fund her disability benefits and her father's military survivor benefits. They took $96,000 meant for this child's future and used it to fund a luxury vacation to Hawaii with their other grandchildren, the ones they deemed worthy of their love. The next photo showed my parents and Madison with her children at the resort, raising tropical drinks in a toast. The timestamp clearly showed it was taken the morning after Emma's abandonment. While Emma sat in a foster care facility, traumatized and wondering what she'd done wrong, her grandparents were celebrating their freedom. Freedom from the burden of loving a child who was different. Freedom bought with stolen money. Freedom that came at the cost of a little girl's sense of worth. Jennifer moved closer to the jury box. The defense will try to paint this as a misunderstanding. They'll claim the defendants were elderly overwhelmed, that they made a mistake in a moment of desperation. But the evidence will show months of planning, systematic theft spanning years, and a pattern of fraud that extended far beyond Emma. You'll hear about stolen church funds and elderly relatives left to die in substandard care while their money disappeared, and a conspiracy to have Emma permanently institutionalized so they could continue stealing her benefits. She paused, making eye contact with each juror. This wasn't a mistake. It was a crime. Multiple crimes. And at the center of it all was a little girl whose only crime was being born different. The defendants had a choice. They could have loved Emma as she was. They could have returned her to her mother if they truly couldn't care for her. Instead, they chose cruelty. They chose greed. They chose to throw away a child for the price of a vacation. Jennifer returned to her seat, but her final words hung in the air. The evidence will show that Harold Fletcher, Margaret Fletcher, and Madison Chen conspired to abandon a vulnerable child and steal her future. We ask that you hold them accountable for their choices. We ask that you bring justice for Emma. The defense attorney, Robert Steinberg, was an older man with silver hair and an expensive suit that screamed, high-powered legal firm. My parents had somehow scraped together enough money for serious representation, probably from their other victims' funds. "Oh, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice soothing and grandfatherly, "what you've just heard is a prosecution narrative designed to inflame your emotions. But this case isn't about emotion, it's about facts. And the facts will show that my clients are not the monsters the prosecution wants you to believe they are." He gestured toward my parents. Harold and Margaret Fletcher are 71 and 68 years old, respectively. They raised 2 daughters, served their church faithfully for 40 years, and have been pillars of their community. They are not criminals. They are grandparents who found themselves in an impossible situation. The evidence will show that Emma Morrison, while undoubtedly a sweet child, has significant special needs that require professional care. Her autism isn't the mild condition the prosecution suggests. She has meltdowns. She requires strict routines. She needs specialized care that elderly grandparents simply couldn't provide. I gritted my teeth, wanting to scream that none of that was true. Emma hadn't had a real meltdown in over a year. Her routines were no more strict than any other child's preference for consistency. My clients made a desperate decision, yes, but they didn't abandon Emma on the street. They took her to a fire station, a safe haven, where they knew she would be cared for and her mother notified. This was an act of desperation by overwhelmed caregivers, not the calculated cruelty the prosecution alleges. He moved on to Madison. As for Madison Chen, she is a mother of 3 who was trying to give her children a memorable vacation with their grandparents. She had no knowledge of any plan to abandon Emma. She trusted her parents as any daughter would. She is as much a victim here as anyone now separated from her children because of a misunderstanding that has spiraled out of control. Steinberg's voice took on a harder edge. The prosecution wants you to believe this is about discrimination against a special needs child, but what it's really about is a daughter who has weaponized the legal system against her own parents. Ashley Morrison was content to let her parents provide free childcare for years, despite their advancing age and health concerns. When they finally admitted they couldn't handle Emma's needs, instead of understanding, she chose vengeance. I felt Catherine's hand on my arm steadying me. The urge to stand up and refute every lie was overwhelming. The financial allegations are equally overblown, Steinberg continued. Money moved between family accounts, yes, but in families, particularly elderly parents and adult children, such transfers are common. There was no theft, simply misunderstandings about verbal agreements and shared expenses. My clients used their own retirement savings for that vacation, not stolen funds. He returned to his seat, but not before one final emotional appeal. Harold and Margaret Fletcher are not criminals. They are loving grandparents who made a desperate decision when faced with a situation beyond their capabilities. Madison Chen is not a conspirator. She's a mother now denied her children because of prosecutorial overreach. We ask that you look past the emotion and see the truth. This is a family tragedy, not a criminal conspiracy. Judge Hawkins called a brief recess before the first witness. In the hallway, Jennifer found me by the water fountain. "Don't let the defense narrative get to you," she said quietly. "I've got 17 witnesses lined up to demolish every claim he just made. By the time we're done, the jury will see exactly who your parents really are." "It's the lies about Emma that kill me," I admitted, making her sound like some uncontrollable burden when she's the easiest, sweetest child. "Her teachers will testify. Her therapist will testify. We have a year's worth of progress reports showing she's thriving. Trust the process, Ashley. Truth has a way of shining through lies." As we returned to the courtroom, I noticed several members of my parents' church in the gallery, but instead of the hostile glares, I expected many looked troubled, conflicted. Martha Williams, who'd sent me that apologetic text after Emma's testimony, gave me a small nod of support. The first witness was Detective Marcus Thompson, who'd taken our initial report. He walked through the evidence methodically, the security footage, the abandoned backpack with its heartbreaking note Emma's state when she was found. In my 23 years in law enforcement, he said, I've seen a lot of child abandonment cases. What struck me about this one was the calculated nature of it. This wasn't a parent dropping off a newborn in a moment of panic. This was grandparents who had weeks to contact the mother to make alternative arrangements. Instead, they chose to abandon the child and flee the state. Under cross-examination, Steinberg tried to paint it as a miscommunication. Isn't it possible they believed Ms. Morrison had agreed to this arrangement? Detective Thompson's expression was skeptical. If that were true, why flee to Hawaii? Why empty the child's college fund? Why leave a note apologizing? No, sir, everything about this indicated they knew exactly what they were doing and that it was wrong. The next witness was the foster care worker who'd been with Emma that night. Her testimony was devastating. She kept asking if she'd been bad. The woman said, tears in her eyes. She wanted to know what she'd done to make her grandparents not love her anymore. She was trying so hard to be brave, but she was terrified. She asked if her mom knew where she was, if her mom was okay. Even abandoned and scared, her first thought was for others. The defense wisely kept their cross-examination brief. There was no way to spin a traumatized 8-year-old asking what she'd done wrong. As the day wore on, witness after witness painted a picture of calculated cruelty and systematic theft. Bank officials detailed the suspicious transfers. Church board members reluctantly testified about missing funds. A social worker who'd investigated Richard's mother's death revealed the substandard conditions she'd been kept in while my parents lived off her money. By the time court adjourned for the day, the defense's narrative of overwhelmed grandparents was in tatters. But I knew Steinberg was too good a lawyer to give up. He'd have tricks up his sleeve character witnesses experts to testify about the challenges of raising special needs children. As I gathered my things, a hand touched my shoulder. I turned to find Pastor David from my parents' church. "I wanted you to know," he said quietly, "that regardless of what happens here, your parents will never be welcome in our congregation again. What they did to Emma, what they stole from families in need, it's unforgivable. I'm testifying for the prosecution tomorrow. It's time the truth came out." That night, I sat with Emma and her cousins around our dinner table. Trevor Madison's eldest had been quiet since moving in with us, but tonight, he spoke up. "Aunt Ashley, I heard some kids at school talking about the trial. They said Grandma and Grandpa are bad people, but they were always nice to me." I chose my words carefully. Sometimes people can be nice to some people and not nice to others. That doesn't make it okay. Everyone deserves kindness, not just the people who are easy to be nice to. Emma, who'd been quietly arranging her peas in a perfect spiral, looked up. "They were nice to you because you're not autistic like me, but being autistic isn't bad. It's just different. Like how some people are left-handed and some are right-handed." Sophie, the middle child, piped up, "I'm left-handed." "Exactly." Emma smiled at her cousin. "And nobody would leave you at a fire station for being left-handed because that would be silly. Just like leaving me for being autistic was silly and mean and illegal." from the mouths of babes. In her simple, direct way, Emma had explained discrimination better than any adult could. As I tucked the children into bed that night, I reflected on how much had changed in 3 months. My family of 2 had become a family of 5. My parents had gone from respected retirees to federal defendants. Emma had gone from an abandoned child to a symbol of resilience for the autism community. Tomorrow would bring more testimony, more evidence, more pain dragged into the light. But tonight, in this house full of children learning to heal and love each other, we had already won the only victory that really mattered. We'd chosen love over convenience, acceptance over prejudice, family over money, and that was worth more than anything my parents had stolen. Day 3 of the trial arrived with Madison taking the stand. She'd been transferred from federal detention to the courthouse early that morning, and the strain showed in every line of her face. Her attorney had coached her well. She wore a conservative blue dress that made her look younger, more vulnerable, but I knew my sister. Behind those carefully dabbed tears was a calculating mind already working the angles. Jennifer Walsh approached the witness stand with the predatory grace of a prosecutor who knew she had her prey cornered. Ms. Chen, you've heard the testimony over the past 2 days. Your parents abandoned your 8-year-old niece at a fire station. Do you deny knowing about this plan? Madison's voice came out small, hesitant. I thought Emma was being placed in specialized care. My parents said they'd found a wonderful facility that could help with her needs. A facility? Did they give you a name? A brochure? Any documentation about this wonderful place? No, but I trusted them. They're my parents. Jennifer clicked her remote, displaying an email on the courtroom screen. I'd like to direct your attention to Prosecution Exhibit 47. This is an email you sent to your mother on August 3rd, 6 weeks before Emma's abandonment. Would you please read the highlighted portion? Madison's hands trembled as she leaned toward the microphone. Operation Fresh Start is a go. I've convinced Daniel to take the kids to his mother's that weekend, so we'll be free to travel once you've handled the Emma situation. Handled the Emma situation, Jennifer repeated slowly. That's an interesting way to describe placing a child in specialized care. What did you mean by handled? I just meant once they'd made arrangements for her care. I see. And what about this email from July 22nd? Another document appeared on screen. This one says, quote, "The fire station plan is perfect. No questions, no paperwork, no trail back to us. Can you explain why specialized care facilities would involve fire stations?" Madison's carefully constructed facade began to crack. I was confused. My mother mentioned fire stations as safe havens. I thought she meant metaphorically. Metaphorically, Jennifer's voice dripped skepticism. Let's move on to another email, shall we? August 15th, exactly 1 month before Emma's abandonment. You wrote, make sure you get all the money out first. Once she's gone, Ashley might try to freeze the accounts. Why would your sister freeze accounts if Emma was just going to a care facility? I don't remember writing that. You don't remember? Well, perhaps this will refresh your memory. Jennifer produced a printed email chain. This is a conversation between you and your mother discussing, quote, how long before someone finds her at the station? Does that sound like specialized care to you? Madison's attorney objected, but Judge Hawkins overruled him. The evidence was admissible and damning. Ms. Chen, let's discuss the financial aspect. How much did your Hawaii vacation cost? I don't know. My parents paid for everything. According to credit card records, the total came to $37,000. First-class flights for 5 the presidential suite excursions shopping sprees, all paid for with cashier's checks drawn from Emma's college fund. Were you aware of the source of this money? My parents said they'd been saving for a special family vacation. Jennifer's smile was sharp as a blade. Saving, let's examine that. This is your Facebook post from August 1st. The screen showed Madison's social media page. You wrote, finally the family vacation we deserve. No more having to cater to special needs. Just pure relaxation with the grandchildren who matter. What did you mean by that? Madison's face flushed. That's taken out of context. Then please provide the context. Which grandchildren matter, Ms. Chen? I didn't mean it like that. No. Then how did you mean it? Because it seems clear to everyone in this courtroom that you meant your children matter and Emma doesn't. Objection. Madison's attorney was on his feet. Counsel is badgering the witness. I'll rephrase, Jennifer said smoothly. Ms. Chen, did you or did you not know that your parents planned to abandon Emma? Madison looked desperately at her attorney, then at our parents. My mother gave her a hard stare and something shifted in Madison's expression. It wasn't abandonment, she said, her voice stronger now. It was practical. Emma is difficult. She requires special attention. Special food, special everything. My parents are elderly. They couldn't keep caring for her. So you did know about the plan? I knew they needed a solution. Emma was dragging everyone down. My children couldn't have normal grandparent experiences because everything had to revolve around Emma's needs. The mask had slipped completely now. This was the real Madison. Bitter, entitled, jealous of any attention not directed at her or her children. Jennifer pounced. What specific needs are you referring to? According to Emma's teachers and therapist, she requires minimal accommodations. She eats the same foods as other children, just prefers they not touch. She occasionally needs a quiet space when overstimulated. That's it. So what exactly was so burdensome? You don't understand, Madison snapped. It's constant. The humming, the organizing things, the questions about everything, and the meltdowns. When was Emma's last meltdown? Madison paused. There was one at Christmas. You mean 2 Christmases ago when she politely asked to go to a quiet room because the music was too loud. Her therapist testified yesterday that wasn't a meltdown, it was appropriate self-advocacy. She ruins everything. The words burst out of Madison like a dam breaking. Every family event, every holiday, every photo has to accommodate Emma. My kids can't even play normally because we have to be quiet for Emma, careful around Emma, understanding of Emma. It's always about Emma. The courtroom was dead silent. Several jurors looked horrified. One woman had her hand over her mouth in shock. Jennifer let the confession hang in the air before continuing. So you decided she had to go. She's not even really family. Madison was fully unraveling now. She's nothing like us. She'll never have a normal life, never contribute anything. Why should my children's inheritance go to someone who'll just be a drain on society forever? I see. And what about your parents' theft from other family members, Richard Morrison's mother, who died in substandard care while your parents stole her benefits? That old woman was dying anyway. The money was better used for the living. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Even Madison's own attorney looked appalled. What about the church fundraisers, the cancer patient whose treatment money your parents skimmed? I don't know anything about that. No, this email suggests otherwise. Another document appeared. You wrote to your mother, be more careful with the church money. People are starting to ask questions. That doesn't sound like someone who knew nothing. Madison's composure shattered completely. You don't understand what it's like. Ashley got all the attention, all the sympathy. Poor Ashley with her dead hero husband. Poor Ashley with her special needs child. Everything was always about Ashley's struggles. What about me? What about my children? When do we get to be the priority? So you made yourselves the priority by stealing from a disabled child. We didn't steal. We took what should have been ours anyway. That money came from military benefits that should have gone to all the grandchildren, not just Emma. My parents worked hard their whole lives. They deserved a nice vacation without having to drag along a child who can't even appreciate it. Jennifer stepped back, letting Madison's words poison the air. No further questions, Your Honor. Madison's own attorney approached for damage control, but the harm was done. Every question he asked only seemed to dig the hole deeper. Madison, you love your niece, don't you? Love is a strong word. I tolerate her for Ashley's sake. You were upset about being separated from your children. Of course, I'm upset. My children are normal, well-behaved, deserving of love. They're suffering because Ashley had to make this all about Emma as usual. By the time Madison left the stand, she'd transformed from a potentially sympathetic figure into exactly what she was, a bitter, jealous woman who'd conspired to throw away a child out of pure spite. During the lunch break, Catherine found me in the courthouse cafeteria. That was even better than we hoped. She confessed to everything. She's always been jealous, I said, pushing salad around my plate. Even as kids, she couldn't stand when I got attention. When Richard died, she actually told me maybe it was for the best, because now I wouldn't be a military wife getting sympathy forever. And your parents enabled it. They created it. Madison was the golden child who could do no wrong. I was the difficult one who asked questions, didn't just accept things. When Emma was born different, it was like proof to them that I was defective somehow. That afternoon brought a parade of witnesses that further destroyed any sympathy for my family. Emma's teacher testified about what a joy she was in class, how she helped other students with math, how her supposed special needs amounted to nothing more than occasional sensory breaks that took 5 minutes. Her occupational therapist detailed Emma's progress, showing charts and videos of a child who was thriving, not struggling. In my professional opinion, Emma requires less accommodation than many neurotypical children I work with. She's independent, articulate, and manages her sensory needs beautifully. The daycare worker who'd watched Emma during summer breaks testified next. That child is a gift. She's kind, thoughtful, always helping the younger kids. Yes, she likes routine, but so do most children. The idea that she was some unmanageable burden is not just false, it's cruel. Then came the character witnesses for my parents, but even they seemed half-hearted. Their church friends spoke in vague terms about past good works, but when pressed for specifics, they faltered. Several admitted they'd noticed concerning behavior, but hadn't wanted to get involved. Martha Williams took the stand for the prosecution, despite having been friends with my mother for 20 years. Margaret Fletcher told me that Emma was a punishment from God. She said the autism was payment for some sin, that Ashley must have done something terrible to deserve a defective child. I should have spoken up then. I should have defended that baby. I'll regret my silence for the rest of my life. By the time court adjourned, the defense's case was in ruins. Madison had confessed on the stand. Character witnesses had turned hostile. The evidence was overwhelming. That evening, Daniel came to pick up his children for his first supervised visit since the arrest. He looked exhausted but determined. "I watched the news coverage," he said quietly, while the kids gathered their things. "I can't believe Madison said those things. How did I not see who she really was?" "She was good at hiding it," I offered. "She learned from the best." "The kids seem happier here, more relaxed. Sophie actually hugged Emma yesterday. Madison would have had a fit about her touching the defective child." "They're good kids, Daniel. They just need to unlearn some poisonous ideas." He nodded. "Thank you for taking them in. When I get back from deployment, I want them to keep seeing Emma. She's good for them. Shows them that different doesn't mean less than." As I watched him drive away with his children, I thought about families, how they could be sources of both the greatest love and the deepest betrayal. My parents and sister had chosen cruelty, greed, and prejudice. But in doing so, they'd inadvertently created a new family, one bound not by blood, but by choice, acceptance, and genuine love. Tomorrow would likely bring my parents' testimony. They would paint themselves as victims, elderly people overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. But Madison had already shown the jury the truth. This wasn't about age or ability. It was about hate, pure and simple, hate for a child who dared to be different. Hate that was willing to throw away an 8-year-old for the price of a vacation. The prosecution was winning, but I took no joy in it. Somewhere in that federal detention center were the people who'd raised me, who taught me to tie my shoes and ride a bike. People I'd once loved who'd become strangers, capable of unimaginable cruelty. But upstairs, Emma was helping her cousins with homework, patient and kind despite everything they'd represented in her grandparents' cruel hierarchy. She was proving every day that my parents were wrong. She wasn't a burden or a punishment or a mistake. She was exactly what she'd always been, a gift they'd been too blind to see. The morning my mother took the stand, the courthouse steps were packed with protesters. Autism advocacy groups held signs reading, "All children matter" and "Different, not less." Counter-protesters, a smaller group from my parents' church, held their own signs proclaiming family values and "respect your elders." The divide in public opinion was visible, but the tide had clearly turned against my parents. Inside the courtroom, my mother looked every day of her 68 years, and then some. The orange jumpsuit hung loose on her frame, and her hands shook as she placed them on the Bible to take her oath. But her eyes held the same hard glint I'd seen my whole life when she was convinced she was right. As Robert Steinberg approached his client with grandfatherly concern. "Mrs. Fletcher, tell us about your relationship with your granddaughter, Emma." My mother's voice came out reedy but determined. "I loved that child. Despite everything, I loved her." Despite what? Despite her challenges. Emma isn't like other children. She's difficult, demanding. Everything has to be just so or she falls apart. "Can you give us examples?" My mother shifted in her seat, warming to her theme. She has to eat foods in a certain order. The vegetables can't touch the meat. The meat can't touch the starch. If anything touches, she won't eat at all. Do you know how hard it is to prepare meals like that? Several jurors looked puzzled. One woman actually frowned, probably thinking of her own children's food preferences. "What else?" Steinberg prompted. The humming. Constant humming when she's thinking. And the questions. She never stops asking questions. Why is the sky blue? Why do people say things they don't mean? Why can't she wear her noise headphones to church? It's exhausting. "Tell us about the night of September 15th. My mother's expression shifted to what she probably thought looked martyred, but came across as calculating. We'd been watching Emma for the weekend. Harold's back was acting up, and I have arthritis. Emma wanted to go to the park, but we couldn't manage it. She started getting agitated, asking over and over. Then she began organizing all my spices alphabetically. I asked her to stop, but she said it would make finding things easier. She wouldn't listen. So you decided to take her to the fire station. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." For the first time, my mother seemed genuinely distressed. "We were just going to drive around, maybe get ice cream, calm her down." But she kept talking about how Mommy would take her to the park, how Mommy understood her needs. And I just snapped. This child we'd bent over backward for, comparing us to her mother, finding us lacking. What happened next? I remembered the safe haven law. Fire stations have to take children, no questions asked. They have resources professionals, people equipped to handle special children like Emma. It seemed like the perfect solution. Steinberg nodded sympathetically. "You thought she'd receive better care." "I knew she would. Those people are trained for difficult children. We're just old people trying our best." "What about the money from Emma's college fund?" My mother's chin lifted defiantly. "That money came from my daughter's household. Harold and I helped raise both our daughters. We deserve some compensation for our years of free childcare. The vacation was modest, just a chance to spend time with our other grandchildren without having to cater to Emma's endless needs." "Oh, modest." Jennifer Walsh's voice cut through the courtroom on her objection. $37,000 is modest." Judge Hawkins sustained the objection, but the damage was done. Steinberg tried to recover. "Did you intend to abandon Emma permanently?" "Of course not. We thought Ashley would be contacted immediately, that she'd retrieve Emma within hours. It was meant to be a wake-up call to show her that she needed professional help with that child." No further questions. Jennifer Walsh rose for cross-examination like an avenging angel. Mrs. Fletcher, you say you loved Emma despite her challenges. What exactly do you mean by despite? Well, she's not an easy child to love, not like Madison's children. I see. And what makes Madison's children easier to love? They're normal. They play like normal children, eat like normal children, act like normal children. You can take them anywhere without worrying about sensory issues or meltdowns or embarrassing questions. Embarrassing questions. Can you give an example? My mother flushed. At church, once she asked Pastor David why he said God loves everyone, but then said gay people were sinning. In front of everyone, a normal child would never ask such a thing. A few jurors actually smiled at that. One man tried to cover his chuckle with a cough. So Emma embarrassed you by expecting consistency between stated beliefs and actions? That's not what I meant. No, then what did you mean? Because it sounds like you're saying Emma was too intelligent, too honest, too direct for your comfort. She lacks social understanding. Does she? Her teacher testified that she's helpful and kind to other students. Her therapist said she shows remarkable empathy. So what social understanding does she lack? The understanding that some things shouldn't be said, like asking why grandparents who claim to love all their grandchildren would abandon one of them. My mother's face went red. We didn't abandon her. We placed her in safe hands. Safe hands. You left an 8-year-old alone at a fire station at night with nothing but a backpack and a stuffed animal. How is that safe? The firefighters were there. Did you go inside to ensure someone was present? Did you speak to anyone, or did you just dump her at the door and run? We knew someone would find her. Jennifer pulled up the security footage on the screen. Let's watch what actually happened, shall we? The video played in damning silence. My mother walking Emma to the door, looking around nervously. Emma asking something, my mother shaking her head. The quick kiss on Emma's head, then my mother practically running back to the car. The timestamp showed they drove away within 90 seconds of arriving. Does that look like carefully placing a child in safe hands, Mrs. Fletcher? We were emotional. It was hard for us, too. Hard for you. You were on a beach in Maui 12 hours later. Let's talk about that. You said the vacation was modest. Shall we review the receipts? For the next hour, Jennifer methodically destroyed every claim my mother made. The modest vacation included $5,000 shopping sprees, helicopter, tours, spa treatments. The difficult child had progress reports showing remarkable improvement and minimal accommodation needs. The free childcare they'd provided had been compensated by my paying for groceries, utilities, and maintenance at their home. Mrs. Fletcher, let's discuss your statement to church friends that Emma was, quote, God's punishment for some unnamed sin. What did you mean by that? My mother's composure cracked. I never said that. We have 3 witnesses who testified under oath that you did. Are they all lying? They misunderstood, like the jury is misunderstanding. Like we all misunderstood when you called Emma defective in emails, when you said she'd be better off dead than living as a burden, when you planned for months to get rid of her so your real grandchildren could inherit everything. She's not normal, my mother screamed. She'll never be normal. Why should she get the same as children who will actually contribute to society? Why should my retirement be spent catering to a child who will never marry, never have children, never be anything but a drain on resources? The courtroom went dead silent. Even Steinberg looked horrified. Jennifer stepped back. Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher. You've just explained to this jury exactly why you abandoned Emma. No further questions. The redirect was painful to watch. Steinberg tried to soften the impact, but my mother was beyond help. Every question just led to more damaging admissions. You didn't mean Emma would be a drain forever, did you? Of course I did. Have you seen the statistics for autistic adults? Most never live independently, never hold real jobs, never have families. We were supposed to waste our final years and Madison's children's inheritance on a lost cause. By the time my mother left the stand, several jurors were visibly disgusted. One woman was actually crying. My father took the stand that afternoon. If my mother had been defiant, he was defeated. He looked like he'd aged a decade in custody. His shoulders slumped, his voice barely above a whisper. Steinberg tried the same sympathetic approach. "Mr. Fletcher, tell us about your relationship with Emma." I tried to love her. I wanted to. But Margaret, my wife, she made it so hard. Every time I showed Emma affection, Margaret would remind me about our real grandchildren, how they deserved better. This was new. Was my father actually going to throw my mother under the bus? "Did you want to leave Emma at the fire station?" "No." The word came out choked. "I begged Margaret to just call Ashley, say we needed a break. But she said Ashley would guilt us, make us feel bad for not being able to handle one special child when she managed alone. She said this was the only way." "Why didn't you refuse?" My father's voice broke. "Have you been married for 45 years? You learn to pick your battles. And Margaret, when she decides something, it's decided." Part of me felt a flicker of sympathy. I'd grown up watching my father capitulate to my mother's will, choosing peace over principle every time. But then I remembered Emma's face that night, and my sympathy evaporated. Jennifer's cross-examination was surgical. "Mr. Fletcher, you say you didn't want to abandon Emma, but you drove the car, correct?" "Yes." "You could have turned around at any point." "Margaret would have—" "I didn't ask what your wife would have done. I asked if you could have turned around. You were driving. You had control of the vehicle. Could you have turned around?" Yes. "But you didn't. You drove your 8-year-old granddaughter to a fire station and left her there. You made that choice." Margaret said, "Mr. Fletcher, are you aware that following orders isn't a legal defense for child abandonment?" My father seemed to shrink even further. "I know." "Let's talk about the money. Bank records show you personally withdrew funds from Emma's college account. Your signature, your ID used. Was Margaret holding a gun to your head?" "No." "So you chose to steal from your granddaughter." "It wasn't stealing. We were owed that money for all the times we watched her." There it was, the entitlement beneath the defeated exterior. Jennifer pounced. "Owed your daughter, paid for your groceries, your utilities, maintained your home. But you were owed more. Do you know what we gave up for those girls? The retirement we could have had without children always needing something. We deserved something for ourselves." "So you took it from a disabled 8-year-old's college fund." "She probably won't even go to college. Margaret's right about that. Most autistic kids don't. Why save money for a future that won't happen when we could use it now?" And there went any sympathy the jury might have had. My father, trying to play the henpecked husband, had just revealed he was every bit as culpable as my mother. "Mr. Fletcher, do you know what Emma wants to be when she grows up?" He looked confused by the seemingly random question. "No." "She wants to be a mathematician. Her teacher says she's gifted in mathematics, already working 2 grade levels ahead. But you assumed she'd never go to college because she's autistic." Margaret said. "What else did Margaret say that you chose to believe that Emma was defective, that she was God's punishment, that she'd be better off dead?" "I never said she'd be better off dead." "No, this email from you to your wife says maybe it would be merciful if God took her before she realizes how different she is." "What did you mean by merciful?" My father's face crumpled. I was just trying to agree with Margaret, to keep peace." "You kept peace by wishing death on your granddaughter." "That's not what I meant." "Then explain it. Explain to this jury how hoping God takes a child before she grows up is anything other than wishing for her death." My father broke down completely, then sobbing on the stand. But they weren't tears of remorse for Emma. They were tears of self-pity, of being caught, of facing consequences for choices he'd made freely. "I'm an old man," he wept. "I just wanted some peace in my final years. Is that so wrong?" Jennifer's voice was ice. when it comes at the cost of abandoning a child. Yes, Mr. Fletcher, it's wrong, it's criminal, and it's unforgivable. The redirect was brief. Steinberg knew his client was beyond salvage. Both my parents had revealed themselves completely selfish, entitled, cruel people who'd convinced themselves their comfort mattered more than a child's life. As court adjourned, I overheard two jurors whispering in the hallway. "I can't believe they wished her dead," one said. "That beautiful little girl." "The father's almost worse," the other replied. "At least the mother owns her evil. He wants to pretend he was forced into it while saying the same horrible things." I drove home in a daze, trying to reconcile the monsters on the stand with the parents who'd raised me. But maybe that was the point. Maybe they'd always been these people, and I'd just been too desperate for their love to see it. At home, Emma was teaching her cousins a new card game, patiently explaining the rules as many times as they needed. She looked up as I entered, her face bright with welcome. "Mommy, we're playing prime numbers. Go fish. I invented it. You can only ask for prime numbers, and you have to explain why they're prime when you get a set." This brilliant, creative, loving child, the one my parents thought would never go to college, never contribute to society, never be anything but a burden. She'd already contributed more joy and wisdom to the world in 8 years than they had in 7 decades. "That sounds amazing, baby. Can I play?" "Of course, but you have to sit next to James. He needs help remembering which numbers are prime." As I settled in next to my nephew, watching Emma patiently teach him about prime numbers, I thought about my parents' testimony. They'd sealed their own fate today, showing the jury exactly who they were beneath the grandparent masks. But more than that, they'd shown everyone watching what we lose when we decide some children matter less than others. We lose brilliance. We lose joy. We lose the opportunity to learn from those who see the world differently. My parents would learn that lesson in federal prison, but Emma, she was too busy teaching her cousins about prime numbers to waste time on people who'd never seen her value. And that more than any verdict was real justice. The jury had been deliberating for 2 days. 48 hours of my life spent pacing the courthouse hallways, checking my phone obsessively, and trying to keep 5 children distracted from the weight of waiting. Catherine assured me that longer deliberations meant careful consideration of all charges, but each passing hour felt like a year. Emma knew today might be the day. She dressed carefully that morning, choosing her court clothes, a purple dress with silver stars that she said made her feel brave. The cousins wore their best clothes too, understanding that something important was happening even if they didn't grasp all the details. Mommy," Emma said as I braided her hair, "what happens if the jury says Grandma and Grandpa were right to leave me?" My hands stilled. "They won't say that, baby. What they did was wrong, and everyone knows it." "But what if they don't?" I turned her to face me, taking her small face in my hands. "Then we keep living our lives. We keep being our family. We keep proving every single day that you are exactly who you're supposed to be. The jury doesn't decide your worth, Emma. That's already been decided, and you are priceless." She smiled, that gap-toothed grin that had been notably absent during the trial coverage, like a rare prime number that hasn't been discovered yet. Exactly like that. My phone buzzed at 9:47 a.m. Catherine's name flashed on the screen. "They're back." The courthouse was a zoo. News vans lined every available space, reporters doing stand-ups with the building as backdrop. Protesters from both sides had returned in force, though the autism advocacy group significantly outnumbered my parents' dwindling supporters. Inside the gallery, filled quickly, I recognized faces from the past weeks. The court reporter who'd given Emma a sympathetic smile, the bailiff who'd snuck her peppermints during breaks, the sketch artist who'd captured my parents' cruelty in stark pencil strokes. My parents entered looking haggard. My mother's defiance had crumbled into something hollow, while my father seemed to have shrunk even further into himself. Madison maintained her victim act, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, though I noticed they remained notably dry. All rise for the Honorable Judge Patricia Hawkins. Judge Hawkins took her seat, her expression grave. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The jury foreman, a middle-aged black man with kind eyes, stood. We have, Your Honor. Will the defendants please rise? My parents struggled to their feet, chains clanking. Madison rose gracefully, still playing her part. On the charge of conspiracy to commit child abandonment, how do you find the defendant, Harold Fletcher? Guilty. The word rang through the courtroom like a bell. My mother swayed slightly. The foreman continued through all 15 charges against my father. Guilty on every count. The courtroom was silent, except for the reading of verdicts. Each guilty, another nail in the coffin of their carefully constructed lies. My mother's verdicts came next. Guilty on all 17 charges, including the assault on a federal officer. Her legs gave out at number 12, and she had to be supported by court officers. Then Madison. As the foreman read through her 11 charges, all guilty, her carefully maintained composure finally cracked completely. She began sobbing. Real tears this time, as the reality of her situation hit home. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the court thanks you for your service, Judge Hawkins said. We'll reconvene for sentencing in 30 days. Until then, the defendants will remain in federal custody. Court is adjourned. The gallery erupted. Reporters rushed for the doors to file their stories. Supporters of both sides began talking at once. Through it all, I sat frozen, Catherine's hand on my shoulder. It's over, she said quietly. You did it. Emma did it. Justice. But it didn't feel like justice. It felt like loss. The final severing of a family that had been broken long before that night at the fire station. Outside the courthouse, Jennifer Walsh met us on the steps. The judge wants to see you in chambers. Just you, not the media circus. Judge Hawkins's chambers were surprisingly warm, filled with plants and photos of grandchildren. She gestured for me to sit, her stern courtroom demeanor softening. Miss Morrison, I've presided over thousands of cases in my career. This one will haunt me. The cruelty shown to that child by people who should have protected her. It defies comprehension. Thank you, Your Honor. I want you to know that at sentencing, I intend to impose the maximum allowable punishment. Your parents and sister have shown no genuine remorse, only self-pity. They're a danger to vulnerable populations. Children, the elderly, anyone they can exploit. What about the others, the church victims, my husband's mother? The FBI is pursuing separate charges. Your parents will likely spend the rest of their lives in prison. Your sister? She's young enough to potentially serve her time and rebuild. Whether she chooses to is up to her. I thought of Madison's children adjusting slowly to life in our chaotic but loving home. Her children are doing well. They're learning that love isn't conditional. Judge Hawkins smiled. I've seen the reports from the social workers. You've done an amazing thing taking them in. Many people wouldn't have. They're innocent in this, and Emma loves them. She's teaching them math and patience and how to see the world differently. They're teaching her that not everyone will reject her for being autistic. That little girl's testimony was the most powerful I've ever seen. So composed, so clear about her own worth despite everything. You've raised a remarkable child. She raised herself in many ways. I just gave her the space to be who she is. Judge Hawkins leaned forward. I hope you know this verdict isn't just about punishment. It's about affirming Emma's worth, stating unequivocally that what happened to her was wrong. No child should ever be thrown away for being different. As I left her chambers, I felt something shift inside me. The anger that had sustained me through the trial began to ease, replaced by something lighter. Not forgiveness, that might never come, but release. The media gauntlet outside was intense. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, microphones pressed forward. Catherine had prepared a statement, but I decided to speak from the heart. Today a jury confirmed what everyone who truly knows Emma already knew, that she has value, that she matters. that abandoning a child for being different is not just wrong, but criminal. My parents and sister made their choices, and now they'll face the consequences. But this isn't really about them anymore. It's about Emma and the millions of children like her who deserve love and acceptance exactly as they are. Ashley, how does Emma feel about the verdict? A reporter called out. I thought of my daughter that morning, more concerned about her cousin's feelings than her own vindication. Emma is teaching her cousins a new card game today. She's moved on in the way only children can. She doesn't need a verdict to know her worth. She's always known it. It's the adults who needed this reminder. Will you let her have contact with her grandparents? That will be Emma's choice when she's older. Right now, she's focused on building relationships with people who see her value. She doesn't have time for people who don't. What about forgiveness? The question hung in the air. I'd known it was coming, but still wasn't prepared. Forgiveness isn't mine to give. It's Emma's if and when she chooses. My job is to protect her, to give her the tools to thrive, and to make sure she knows every single day that she is loved exactly as she is. That's what family does. That's what my parents forgot. That evening, we had a quiet celebration at home. Pizza, Emma's choice because we'd missed so many Friday pizza nights during the trial. The cousins had made a banner reading, "Emma is awesome," with handprints in paint. Even Trevor, who'd initially absorbed his mother's prejudices, had written, "Sorry I was mean before. You're the coolest cousin ever." Daniel joined us still in uniform from his deployment prep. He hugged each of his children, then surprised me by hugging Emma too. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing my kids what real family looks like." Emma, never one for sentiment without purpose, patted his arm. "It's okay, Uncle Daniel. Everyone makes mistakes. The important thing is learning from them. Do you want to play prime numbers? Go fish." As the evening wound down and I tucked 5 tired children into bed, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. My family of 2 had become 6. My parents' cruelty had inadvertently created something beautiful. A home where differences were celebrated, where love was unconditional, where children learned that family was about choice, not just blood. Emma was the last to settle her mind, still buzzing with the day's events. "Mommy, I've been thinking about about Grandma and Grandpa going to jail. I'm not happy about it, but I'm not sad either. Is that okay?" "That's perfectly okay. You feel however you need to feel." I think I feel relieved, like when you finally solve a really hard math problem and you can move on to the next one. Does that make sense? Perfect sense from my perfectly sensible daughter. It makes complete sense. Good, because I have a lot of other problems to solve, like teaching James double-digit addition and helping Sophie with her reading, and showing Trevor how to be patient when things don't go his way. Those are more important than thinking about people who didn't want me. She was right, of course. The verdict had closed one chapter, but Emma had already moved on to the next, focused on building rather than dwelling on those who'd tried to tear her down. "I love you, Emma, exactly as you are." "I know, Mommy. That's why you fought for me. That's what people do when they really love someone. They fight for them instead of throwing them away." As I turned off her light and closed the door, I marveled again at her resilience. 8 years old and already understanding truths that had eluded grown adults. My parents had called her defective, a burden, a punishment. The verdict had proven them wrong in the eyes of the law. But Emma, she'd proven them wrong just by being herself. Brilliant, kind, endlessly curious about the world around her. She didn't need a jury to validate her worth. She'd always known it. And that was the greatest justice of all.